We've considered Frege's argument for postulating senses now not once but twice. The argument, I think, is entirely convincing, inescapable. The problem, though, is to understand what senses are. Now, last time we asked that question, I offered you three complementary answers, from least informative to maximally informative, but most controversial. Senses are, just by the way they're postulated, the attribute of propositions or components of propositions that explains the difference in informativeness between propositions like Charlie is Charlie and Charlie is Samantha. Senses are also supposed to be ways of thinking about objects. I don't think that really helps us. But substantively, we saw that you can think about senses as descriptions, so that the sense of Charlie might be the secret agent who is missing, for example. Now, I want to suggest that this idea that we left open as a possibility is entirely untenable. That's interesting because it leaves us with no idea what senses could be. But let's step back a second. The Russellian proposition, which we might express, you or I, by saying Charlie is a secret agent, can be represented like this. There's an order tuple, essentially a set with order in it. The first thing is the property of being a secret agent. The second thing in it is Charlie herself. Likewise for the Russellian proposition that I might express by saying Samantha is a secret agent. These are those Russellian propositions. Now, let's think. The Fregean proposition we get by changing Samantha or Charlie herself into the sense. So if senses are descriptions and the sense of Charlie is the missing secret agent, then the Fregean proposition that we might express by saying that Charlie is a secret agent is this one here. It's a tuple with S in it followed by that description, the missing secret agent. Now this is only very rough here because of course introducing this description here, the description is going to feature as a sense, not as some structured entity in its own right. But you'll see the point even without fully going into theories about the structure of propositions. So you see what we've done here. We've taken the Russellian proposition, in which Charlie herself featured. We've ripped out Charlie and replaced her with the sense on the assumption that the sense is a description. With me so far? Very good, very simple. Not supposed to be introducing anything complicated. Now this is going to help us later. I want to introduce you to Alfred Eisenstadt, a famous photographer, a very influential photojournalist. He said this: when I photographed Marilyn Monroe, I mixed up my cameras. One had black and white film and the other colour. I took many pictures, only 2 colour ones came out all right. Kind of high stakes mistake to make. Anyway, so here's Alfred Eisenstadt. Now, I introduce you to Alfred Eisenstadt because it's going to be relevant to us in a moment. You see, Alfred Eisenstadt, as a matter of fact, lived in Jackson Heights. Of course, I've introduced him to you as the photojournalist who mixed up his cameras while photographing Marilyn Monroe. So I would take this description to be the sense of Alfred Eisenstadt, at least as you're thinking about Alfred Eisenstadt. That's the way that you're thinking about him, the sense or mode of presentation he has for you. So we can consider a second proposition, which is that that description fits someone who lived in Jackson Heights. Now here's the smart thing. If we consider a counterfactual possibility, we'll see that those two propositions are distinct. So here's the counterfactual possibility. Let's say that Eisenstadt couldn't make it. He had terrible, terrible cold. So although he'd been so looking forward to this, unfortunately, poor guy, he couldn't do it. So Martha Holmes, who lived in Manhattan, stepped in and she took the photographs of Marilyn Monroe. Now, if we imagine that counterfactual possibility, what happens to the propositions? Well, the first proposition remains true, right? So having Martha Holmes rather than Alfred Eisenstadt take the photos doesn't change where Alfred Eisenstadt lived. So the first proposition would remain true in this alternative possibility. But the second proposition now becomes false, because the photojournalist who mixed up his cameras while photographing Marilyn Monroe, either there isn't one, so the sentence is false, or else that refers to Martha Holmes, and she also mixed up her cameras, let's say, in which case it's not true that that photojournalist lived in Jackson Heights. So once again, the sentence becomes false. What have we illustrated here? If we consider these two propositions and we just think about the actual world, it seems like they're indistinguishable. But as soon as we watch how they observe in different counterfactual possibilities, we can see that they're not equivalent after all. That if we imagine changing the world, moving to a different possible world, one of the propositions will be true, while the other one will be false. And so they're not equivalent. These two propositions are distinct propositions. They're not equivalent because there's a possible world in which one is false and the other is true. Now this in essence is the argument which Kripke made in a very famous book called Naming and Necessity. Of course, this is just my short version, rough approximation to his argument. Now, how can we convert that into an argument against the idea that senses are descriptions? Good question. Here's how you do it. Assume, for a contradiction, that senses are descriptions. If that's right, then equivalent Fregean propositions would be used to distinguish the contents of two mental states. On the one hand, there's your thought that Alfred Eisenstadt lived in Jackson Heights. On the other hand, there's your thought that the photojournalist who mixed up his cameras while photographing Marilyn Monroe lived in Jackson Heights. If senses are descriptions, then there will be a pair of propositions, there will be a pair of thoughts like this, where actually it's the same Fregean proposition that we use to distinguish the contents of those thoughts. That's to say that we can't distinguish the contents of the thoughts by appeal to these Fregean propositions. But we know that these are not the same thought. We know they're not the same thought because they behave differently in different counterfactual situations. Were it the case that Eisenstadt had stayed in bed and Martha Holmes had taken the photos, this proposition would remain true, but this one would become false. So these are not the same thought. They're clearly thoughts about different scenarios. That being the case, since they're different thoughts, we want to distinguish their contents. So we can't do that using Fregean propositions on the assumption that senses are descriptions. What should we conclude here? That senses are not descriptions. That's the thing that we have to give up. So here is a very rough and ready reconstruction of Kripke's argument that senses are not descriptions. I think this is actually quite compelling. Let's go back. Remember the thing about the Russellian proposition and the Fregean proposition. If we take the sense of Charlie to be the missing secret agent, it works whatever description you have in mind here to be the sense. We get the Fregean proposition corresponding to the Russellian proposition, where we take the thing itself, Charlie, out and replace it with the sense. What you can see here is that we're going to run into exactly the same problem here. In fact, you can see the problem here is even slightly worse, because to say that the missing secret agent is a secret agent is a tautology. There is no possible situation in which that proposition can be false. So the Fregean proposition, which is supposed to capture your thought that Charlie is that Charlie is a secret agent, becomes a proposition which just can't be false in any possible world at all. But that's bad, because on the face of it, your thought that Charlie is a secret agent could easily be false. You imagine that Charlie, she did go off to Secret Service school or however you become a secret agent, but she decided she didn't like you very much, and so she just didn't carry on. She went off and became a school teacher. It's an entirely contingent fact that Charlie is a secret agent, an accident, if you like, of her history. But if we take the Fregean senses to be descriptions, then we're going to end up with at least one proposition about Charlie that ought to be contingent, but is in fact a necessary truth. So we just can't think both that we can use Fregean propositions to distinguish the contents of thoughts, which is after all the main reason why we want them, and also that Fregean senses might be descriptions. What we've seen then is that if we want to know what senses are, we have to accept that they are not descriptions of objects.